Anti-American protests spread. What are the undercurrents that have led to these demonstrations? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The US government had been bracing for scenes like this since the attack on its diplomatic missions in Egypt and Libya on Tuesday evening. On Friday, protests spread after midday prayers in the Middle East, North Africa, and across the Muslim world. US embassies and other symbols of American influence have become focal points for violent demonstrations, leaving hundreds injured. The Pentagon sent US Marines to the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, as protests there continued. The US President Barack Obama was at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., as the bodies of the US ambassador to Libya and 3 co-workers arrived after Tuesday's deadly consulate attack in Benghazi.
We will continue to do everything in our power to protect Americans serving overseas, whether that means increasing security at our diplomatic posts, working with host countries which have an obligation to provide security, and making it clear that justice will come to those who harm Americans. Most of all, even in our grief, we will be resolute.
And as for that film clip that apparently triggered the protests, little is known for sure. It's not even clear that a full-length film exists at all.
This is a fairly volatile situation, and it is in response not to United States policy, not to obviously the administration, not to the American people. It is in response to a video, a film, that we have judged to be reprehensible and disgusting.
Earlier we spoke to President Obama's special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Rashad Hussain. We asked him if he thought the film was being used to stir up long-standing grievances against U.S. foreign policy.
I can't speak to what is going on in the person's mind who's come up with this video, but what I can say is that we can't go through this every single time somebody does something offensive. We had the episode of Terry Jones, there's been other episodes, and certainly it's not limited to speech about Islam, it's about other religions as well, and it's important that we react to this hateful and offensive speech with better speech and through efforts that actually address the underlying causes of intolerance, rather than getting into this state every single time where people are out there protesting in a violent way, even if they're small in number, and the media is out there and covering, even if there's 10 people burning a flag. We've got to get past this sensationalism that occurs in the form of extremists who would respond to it in a violent way, and in the form of those that would turn it into a huge hysteria when every time somebody does something offensive.
But you speak about underlying causes
over and over again.
Underlying causes for huge hysteria when ridiculous videos like this emerge. Is not one of those underlying causes continuing antipathy to U.S. foreign policy in the region, which makes it so easy to make people blame the Obama administration when these silly videos come out?
There's going to be populations of millions and millions and millions of people. And amongst those people, there's going to be individuals with lots of different political views. So why is it that there's, in some places 100 people, 200 people, a few hundred people out there protesting? It's impossible to tell exactly what it is. What we do know is that there was a video that was produced that's highly offensive. And as I said, as an American Muslim myself, I know the place of the Prophet in Islam and the anger and sadness that it causes people when there is an offensive video or a depiction produced. Now, that doesn't in any way excuse violence. I think it's important that people understand that it's a sign of strength and not a sign of weakness to refrain from violence, and to make sure that we're countering this type of negative speech with speech that's better, and continuing to educate people about the underlying causes of intolerance rather than getting into speculation about is it this policy or that policy. The fact of the matter is there's a few hundred people out there in many of these locations that are not representing the views of Muslim communities or people of reason or people of faith around the world.
So what is really behind these protests? To discuss this, we're joined by former senior U.S. government official Flint Leverett. We also have former State Department official Michelle Dunn. And from Philadelphia, Tariq Ramadan, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University. He's also the author of the book, Islam and the Arab Awakening. Professor Leverett, first of all, what exactly is unfolding here?
The discussion has focused very much on this film. And I think that really, among American audiences, I think that really obscures the main point, which is that if it hadn't been this film, it would have been something else that triggered an outburst of a manifestation of very, very deep-seated, long-standing resentment in Arab and Muslim societies about many important aspects of U.S. policy toward the region. When Americans think about this, they will tend to want to say that this is a cultural issue, that there's something about Islam or that Arabs are insufficiently modernized to be able to keep something like this film in proper perspective. I think that it's Americans who are having a cultural problem here and aren't really able to put things in their proper perspective. The proper perspective, at least from the vantage of the Muslim world, is that the United States has been, for many years now, an aggressive and a repressive force in the region. That is the way the United States is perceived. Every serious public opinion poll in the region would show that. And until the United States is willing to come to terms with that reality, its own strategic position in this region is going to continue to decline very precipitously.
Professor Ramadan, though, might it be argued that we can be too quick to look for a linkage to U.S. foreign policy? Isn't this really about domestic jockeying for space in a post-revolutionary environment in some of these countries?
Yes, I think it's not mutually exclusive. It's more than that. It's three things at the same time and three dimensions that we have to consider. The first one is clearly about we have to be quite clear about the movie and what is happening and in which way this is used, because every 6 months we have a new controversy, and we have to be clear about the fact that what was done with this movie, the intention behind is clearly to provoke and to push the people towards emotional reactions, and we every time fall into the trap. The problem here is that we have to say that the great majority of the Muslims are against what is happening. They are not supporting violence, even though they don't like the movie and they don't like what is said about the messenger, peace be upon him. So I think that having said that now, it's very important for the Muslim intellectuals to understand that we cannot just sit and expect from the people not to react emotionally. At the end of the day, there are frustrations, there are many perceptions, as it was said, about the United States that are negative, and the movie is nurturing this. So it's very important for the politicians, the intellectuals, the scholars to come and to say this is anti-Islamic, this is not the way we have to deal with this, and to come with the deep education which is needed about how do we react to such provocations, because we are going to have this every time. The second point has to do with what you are saying within the Muslim majority countries, and this is where now we have something which is an internal struggle among Muslim organizations and political currents within the society, where we see the Salafi also pushing in one direction to present themselves as the true guardian of the Islamic reference against the people who are in power, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Nahda in Tunisia, and also the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. So there is a struggle here, and this is why we should understand that if we don't tackle the issue of these interpretations and the role of some Salafi that are now involved in politics, connected sometimes to violent extremist groups, we are not going to solve the problem. Add to the third dimension, which was mentioned right now, in the West, it's quite important to understand that there are wounds, that there is a memory for the people, that the United States of America was yesterday supporting the dictators and now saying that they are supporting democracy, that still their involvement in the region with the unilateral support towards Israel is perceived as very negative. So all this is there. This is part of the perception. And we have, and this is the last point also to say, that we all cherish freedom of expression, and we should say that we cannot prevent the people from talking, speaking, and expressing themselves. We should not, in the name of these noble values, accept that some people who are racist and promoting bigotry, having an agenda which is to destabilize the country, to use the noble rights for very nasty intentions and political agenda.
Michelle Dunn, do you feel that the administration is looking at the various dimensions of this? Actually, arguably there's an extra one, which is that many of these Salafist groups who are now coming to the fore in some of these demonstrations are being funded by close US allies, whom the US is preventing from democratic reform from even taking place within. I mean, there are all these dimensions. Is this administration up to it, do you think? Do they get it? Are they having this discussion?
Well, I think, this administration feels that they've tried very hard, actually, to improve relations with the Muslim world. That was something that President Obama undertook when he came to office. Now, I don't necessarily think that the administration has done everything right in trying to do that. In all of the elements here that are going into these protests, I think the element of opposition to U.S. policies is probably the least. If you think about it, this is very much parallel to the Danish cartoons, the cartoon portraying the prophet of a few years ago, which provoked very similar, very hot protests. Was that fueled by an underlying hatred of Danish policy in the Middle East? No, it wasn't. It was about the specific offense, the perceived offense to Islam. So I think that's what's going on here, along with the Salafi element that I think is very important, because Salafis in Egypt specifically deliberately went about spreading the information about this very offensive film and really, over a couple of days trying to stir people up. Right. I do think the Salafis in Egypt, in Libya particularly, in Tunisia, feel that they haven't gotten out of these revolutions and the political processes that follow them what they wanted. And so they want to sort of show their ability to stir up trouble. And unfortunately, I think it's probably gotten much bigger even than they intended it to be, because now, this thing really has a ripple effect and has spread to other countries. And, there are hundreds of people demonstrating who haven't even seen the film.
Right, but they do know one
don't
thing,
know
and they
very
resent the
little
United
about
States,
it.
right?
I'm sorry?
The one thing they do know is they resent the United States and its foreign policy there.
No, I think what they feel is that there has been an insult to Islam somehow by America. I mean, this, of course, is a privately made film, but I suppose their only way of protesting it is to go to the American embassy. So I think that's that's what
Professor
it's
Leverett,
about.
I mean, that's it. America. I mean, the American government is a convenient cipher for some of this stuff. Then.
In some respects, that's true, but it ignores the backdrop of why the U.S. government is this convenient cipher, and it becomes the target because even when it's not directly responsible for something like this film, it becomes the target in popular perceptions because of this long record of U.S. policy in the region, U.S. actions in the region that have resulted in the deaths of literally millions of innocent Muslim civilians in places like Iraq. And because of that backdrop, when people have agreements against America, the U.S. government is the very, very ready focus of that. I would also take issue with the idea that Obama and his administration really tried to put things on a better footing with the Muslim world. There were a couple of high-profile speeches in Obama's first year in office. In terms of his policies in the region, he is basically pursuing George W. Bush's policies in the region, except on some things like use of drones to kill people in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. He has doubled down on the Bush administration's policies, and polls would show that after a very brief bump in U.S. standing after Obama was elected, People saw what his administration actually did, and the popularity of the U.S. by some polls is even lower today than it was when Bush left office.
Professor Ramadan, how far should we be linking what's happening to the wider contemporary context, not just of President Obama's widening of the war on terror and extrajudicial killing and so forth, but also the 9/11 anniversary, the U.S. elections, the failure to achieve a two-state solution, the tensions between the U.S., Israel, and Iran? I mean, are all these connected, or do they have any effect at all?
Yes. No, I think they are connected. We can discuss the causes. Is it only because of the movie, or is it also against the American administration, or is it because the Salafi and the internal? All these causes are there. Now, if we look at the consequences, it's quite clear that it has already consequences on what is going on in the Middle East, because it could have tremendous consequences, and it's connected with many dimensions. First, it's quite clear that the great majority of the people in the region, by demonstrating, are also sending a message. And if you heard what happened even in Egypt today, the people who were shouting against the states and even quoting and mentioning the name of Osama bin Laden, these are people who might be on the margin, but quite clearly they are connecting all these demonstrations to something which is a stance against the American policy, and being very unhappy, to tell you the truth, beyond the words that the President Barack Obama gave them at the beginning of his mandate. What was done over the last 4 years, it's very poor in the relationship with the Muslims, and having a more just approach towards the conflict, for example, between Palestine
Professor Ramadan,
and Israel.
But does that mean that, I mean, this is often being put into the context of the immense change wrought by the Arab Spring, but surely then this is actually more of a sign of the continuity after the upheavals of the Arab Spring, that all these issues still remain the same, surely?
Yes, they remain the same, but now we are dealing with something which is new and that we see on the ground. When I was writing the book on what I called uprisings and not revolutions, I was saying that one of the challenges will be the relationship between the different trends. And something like this, with the movie, is now being translated within the society on something which has to be, who are the people who are the more Islamic, so to speak, or promoting the Islamic reference. And by putting the Muslim Brotherhood, or by putting in Nahda, or putting the people who are in Libya in a situation where their relationship with the states is taken as a proof, or could be taken as a proof, that they are not really protecting the Islamic values. If this is perceived as such, the consequences is going to be destabilization within the society. And in fact, the consequences of the uprisings could be, for all these countries, something which is very damaging. Add to this something that we should not forget in the perception of the American policy, is also what is said today and what Israel is saying about Iran. In one way or in another, this is also connected. If something happened after what we are witnessing now in the region, with an attack or Netanyahu going too far in this direction, no one can predict what could be the consequences.
Michelle Dunn, can you see these connections then?
Yes, I think that, certainly, as I mentioned, the incident of the Danish cartoon, right? That was before the uprisings in the Arab world, and it was a very similar type of thing. One of the things that makes it different now is this issue we've already mentioned of the Salafis, and I do think that they chose this issue, particularly, as I said, the Salafis in Egypt are the ones who started it, because they
funded by U.S. allies.
They did want to show that the Muslim Brotherhood, is not the one who's really looking after Islam and so forth, and so that they, they wanted to throw around their weight. I think there's another issue, though, which is in Libya particularly, and this is true in Egypt as well. The security apparatuses have not been reformed and stood up again after those revolutions. In Libya, there's a dearth of security. I think the kind of attack that happened in Libya, which resulted in the death of the American ambassador and 3 other Americans, it would be much more difficult for that to happen in a country that had a real security apparatus. There's a chaotic security situation.
There's a chaotic general situation, though, isn't it? I mean, isn't that partly the problem?
Yes,
Even though in the US, Libya is thought of as mission accomplished, President Obama led from behind, and now we have Libya on the right track. It's far from that.
I think so. I mean, the political process in Libya has gone rather well, but there is this very serious security problem. I do think the United States has been paying inadequate attention to that. Also in Egypt, the whole internal security apparatus is unreformed, and there have been lots of problems with failure of policing and so forth, because they haven't done, and the military didn't do during their period of rule, the sort of security reform they should have started.
All right, Shahab, I don't think this is fundamentally about Salafis or about unreformed security services. There is a bigger issue here in connection with the Arab Spring. Probably public opinion in the Arab world, the Muslim world, is not that radically different today than it was 5 years ago. But what matters today is that in countries touched by the Arab Spring and in other countries in the Muslim world, public opinion matters more. And that if you have any kind of movement in these societies toward political structures that are more
democracy is
representative,
messy, basically.
It's not just that it's messy. In this context, it is guaranteed to get you political orders, governments that are going to be, for perfectly legitimate reasons, less enthusiastic, to say the least, about strategic cooperation with the United States. That is a losing proposition for the United States, and we have yet to come to terms with it.
But I return to this point, though, about the Saudis and the Qataris and the Gulf states actively funding some of the groups who are actually allies of the United States. It's not enough for the US to say, well, look, we're just going to see the birthing pains of these nations. They are intimately connected to what's actually going on.
Of course, and we've seen this movie before. The Taliban would not exist without Saudi Arabia and Saudi funding. In certain ways, Al-Qaeda would not exist without Saudi Arabia and Saudi funding. And it's a little bit like Lucy in the football. We just keep falling for it. We're going to let the Saudis and others fund groups in these countries, funding them in Syria, funding them elsewhere in the region, who have an agenda which is very, very bad from the perspective of U.S.
We've only got a few minutes left already, unfortunately. Professor Ramadan, what would a sensible U.S. foreign policy response be? Right now, all we've heard from President Obama really is talk about justice and retribution. But what should his approach be, do you think?
I think in what was said about distancing themselves from the movie and coming to ask for security for the embassies and responsibility by the government is great. What should be done beyond this is really to reconcile themselves with the principles that they have, because what is just said now is critical. You can't have as allies in the region petro-monarchies and Gulf monarchies where you are supporting a trend of Islam which is literalist, Salafi. We don't have a problem with them as long as they protect our interests and they are capitalists in the economic vision. And at the end, you are not happy with the consequences of what they can do in other countries because they are promoting a very narrow understanding of Islam. So if you work for democracies, it should not be selective. It should not be only in the light of your interests in the region. And this is, once again, the consequence. As much as I agree that the Muslims have problems and they have to be self-critical, as much as I think that the American government should really come to consistency when it comes to human dignity, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to promoting dynamics within the society that are going to more openness and the dignity of the people. This is not what we are seeing. We had some hope about Obama when he came. Unfortunately, the policies that we are seeing now are producing the same contradictions and the same perception that are still very negative. So there is something to be done, and not only to blame the people and the population for violence, but to come to the critical thinking that is needed on the side of the Americans.
And that's the point, Michel Dunn, especially in an election season. All we're getting from President Obama is anyone who does this to an American will not escape unpunished. And it does seem that the Democrats are particularly proud of having such a robust foreign policy right now to take to the Republicans in the election. And so is there any attempt to look at perhaps more enlightened ways forward, which will not perhaps make things even worse? Or is it still you're either with us or against us?
Look, I think we have to look at this. This is the first American ambassador to be killed in the line of duty in decades. This is it's a very difficult thing for the United States. And I think whether it's President Obama or Governor Romney, they have to say that, we stand for the safety of our diplomats and that the countries who have our foreign missions and so forth.
Clearly the rhetoric has
I
to
think that I think that one of the debates that we will have here now is whether the Obama administration has done what it should have done in response to the Arab uprisings. I mean, there's an argument now from the Republican side that actually Obama hasn't done enough. That
even
he said nice,
the Republicans
yes, he said
sure.
nice words from the in the Cairo speech and so forth, but he hasn't done enough. And I think we'll be able to have that conversation now, and we need to have it.
And we'll definitely explore that conversation too. But thank you very much, Michelle Dunn, Flint Leverett, Tariq Ramadan. Thank you all. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.